Okay. Hey, everybody. Today I'm here with the extraordinary Matt Stoller, who has really a Substack, kind of a media enterprise, which I think is really crucial for people to beam into and pay attention to, where he covers corporate monopolies, antitrust, big tech. And we originally met, I think, about 10 years ago through Russell Brand in a different configuration. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got passionate about these certain issues and so on?
Yeah, so I've been in public policy in and around it for about 20 years now. And I did a little bit of media as well, but I got interested in competition policy, which is sort of the body of laws around how corporations are structured and how markets are structured. I got interested in that around kind of like 2009, 10, and got into antitrust a couple of years later. And so I am formally my position is that I'm a director of research at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the American Economic Liberties Project. And we study markets and monopoly power. I also wrote a book called Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. And then I write a Substack, which you so kindly referred to, called The Big Newsletter. And we have a site right now called bigtechontrial.com, where we are doing daily coverage of a big antitrust case against Google, which is happening right now in Alexandria, Virginia. So there we go.
There you go. And so what is the think tank, actually?
So the think tank is it's called the American Economic Liberties Project, AELP, and we started in 2020, although we were a spinoff of a different think tank. And what we do is we research and write about monopolies in tech, in healthcare. We write about antitrust laws. Sometimes we file briefs in court, although we don't litigate ourselves. And the goal is really to deconcentrate power in the economy, to open up markets for workers, small business, and to kind of ratchet back some of the overwhelming power of big business, which at this point is kind of more governing than actually just sort of running businesses. So that's the point of AELP. We believe that liberty resides in the commercial sphere just as it does in the political sphere, and you can't have liberty in politics if you don't have liberty in commerce. That's something that is we have a long track record of thinking about commerce that way in America, and we kind of want to uphold that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into that. I mean, I've been looking at Goliath, and I mean, I guess I'll explain why I thought of you recently. Really wanted to reach out to you. I guess I found that I was feeling confused, and I sense that if I'm feeling confused, probably many other people are feeling confused. There's so much happening around kind of free speech, quote unquote, the internet, censorship,
Right.
and yeah, and then so many people, discuss it in different ways and kind of tweak it in different ways.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of, I'm kind of curious, how would you define your own kind of political position? I mean, do you feel like, do you have a defined political, or do you feel like an independent, or do you feel more like a Bernie Sanders Democrat, or kind of where would you sit on the sort of pendulum of politics?
Well, I think of myself as a populist more than that's where I come from. So I sat on the progressive side, but I'm more of a populist, and I'm a Democrat. I worked in the Senate Budget Committee, ranking member Bernie Sanders. I don't totally share his views on everything, but my book was about a congressman named the last populist, who nicknamed the last populist, Wright Patman, who was from Texas, Texarkana. From 1929 to 1976, he was in Congress, and he modeled his career after a series of farmers in the
76. That's a huge career.
Oh yeah, no, it was great. The reason I wrote the book is because I wanted to. I mean, the Democrats weren't always like corporate and crappy. There was a period when they weren't, and I wanted to understand what happened and why they changed. And Patman was actually a really good figure who upheld that populist mantle. And populism was based on a movement put together by merchants and farmers in the 1880s and 1890s that were dealing with with railroads, the first interstate network system that was privately owned but publicly regulated, and these were massive corporations. For the first time, we didn't have massive corporations before railroads, and farmers were getting screwed by them, and they were trying to figure out what to do. And these were not people who were, lefties. These were business people. They were farmers, and they were trying to sell their crops. They were trying to buy things. They were trying to get credit, and they had a set of political goals and concerns. It was in the post-Civil War era, so there was a lot of culture warring stuff. Race was very important, and they defined a new plank for American politics, and that's the politics that I sympathize with, right? The kind of the populist farmers in the 1880s and 1890s. You bring that forward today, you can find pieces of it everywhere, but I think it's probably most, if you put together kind of like Elizabeth Warren's, some of her policy instincts, some of Bernie Sanders' instincts, a little bit of Trump's instincts on like the Federal Reserve, you mash those all together, and you get basically an attack on big money.
Oh, very cool, very cool. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess let me start with my pressing concern or confusion in a way, because I think maybe that's the
Sure.
Just so many things are happening right now. For instance, the arrest of Pavel Durov, the Telegram CEO.
Okay.
I don't think you've written about.
No, I haven't really followed it, because these are very, it's not that I'm not interested. It's just that there are a huge amount of details in all of these cases, and there's a lot of bad information out there. And so if I want to have an opinion about it, I'm going to have to really spend a lot of time to learn. And right now I'm following a case on Google.
Yeah, so that's the other
case of Google and other. So I don't want to.
Okay,
I can speak broadly to platforms, but I don't want to present myself as any sort of expert about Telegram or any of.
Yeah, beautiful. That's fine.
Right.
Then, so obviously there's the antitrust stuff that's going with Google.
Right.
You also recently about.
Let's talk about Telegram. I don't mean that I can't. I just don't know the details. But I can give you broad conceptualizations of how I think about these kinds of platforms. We need to support Telegram. We need to support. I'm not the conception of free speech that we have today, I think, is very warped and weird and expansive, too expansive. So I'm not a kind of free speech absolutist, because I don't think that it's a particularly coherent view. Nor do I think it has anything to do with American traditions, which are anything like this weird vision of the internet as this paradise where anyone can say anything across borders. That is weird and creepy, and has never been anything like. That's very anti-American. It's not at all what the First Amendment was ever about. So, like, I know this is going to sound surprising, but that's I can explain what my views on speech.
Yeah. Why don't we start with that? That would be great. I'd love to know more.
Yeah, I mean, so I think about speech in the context of newspapers, right? And newspapers, if you older than the American democracy, are actually newspapers, and newspapers are about they spoke to a couple of things, right? De Tocqueville wrote about them. He said in America, one of the weird things between America and Europe, and he was coming from Europe, the old world, where there were lots of monarchies and aristocracies, and it was a very different political culture. And so that's what he was kind of comparing. And you can think of monarchies and aristocracies as fascist regimes, because that's what they were. They were not like, we think of, kings as like people with wore wigs and stuff like that, but they were fascist regimes. And in America, he was like, there's so many newspapers here, and they are often bad, but there's so many that no one who is powerful and wealthy is able to dominate discourse, right? Because you have such a diversity of opinions. And he said every hamlet has its own newspaper. And he also said that newspapers create publics. They create the ability for people to come together and take action together and organize their communities. And that's kind of how I think about questions of speech. Does it allow for people to come together as communities and take action on their own behalf, or express their political concerns and their political needs? And Largely, it's about a balancing of power. So Thomas Jefferson talked about it. If I had to choice between a state and a government and newspapers, I would choose newspapers. I mean that obviously it's a silly hypothetical, but the point is that newspapers play these, and it doesn't have to be like the way that we think about current newspapers. It's just the idea of a media institution that has an audience and has a relationship with audience. It creates publics, and that is the function of the expressive elements that are put into the American Constitution, which the First Amendment is not the most important. The most important historically is actually the postal clause, the one that says that the government can make postal roads, and very quickly followed by the establishment of a post office, which said we're going to have universal distribution of information, and we're going to offer newspapers and magazines subsidized rates so that we can quicken the information flow around the country. These are not like, I don't think you would look at sort of, you could look at this as kind of a network design question, but at no point were they saying, we need to have everybody be able to say anything that they want at any point to anyone. It was, we need to quicken information within the country to build a country, right? And every major regulation of telecommunication systems, be it telegraphs to telephones, radio, television, even the development of the internet, all of these were constructed with the idea that you want to facilitate local control and you want to build a polity. And they also always had prohibitions. The idea that you'd have unlimited amounts of pornography is insane. That is, like the Supreme Court's decisions on speech, right? Some of them have prioritized things like gambling, which is protected by certain speech clauses. Section 230 of the CDA protects big tech firms from engaging in facilitating what they call social casinos or social gaming apps. Pornography, the prevalence of pornography as a free speech issue, this is totally incoherent and inconsistent with hundreds of years of obscenity laws. Now, you can make the argument that obscenity laws are a bad thing and that certain amounts, that pornography is a good thing. But the idea that it's speech, or the idea that we've had no social controls on speech, is it's just not historically accurate. We've always had things like prohibitions on fraud, prohibitions on defamation. We've always had prohibitions on foreign influence of American political discourse. We've always had prohibitions on foreign ownership and control of domestic platforms. So it wasn't even until we didn't allow foreigners to own radio stations or radio technologies or key communication technologies. In fact, it wasn't until 2012, under the Obama administration, that the FCC legalized the foreign ownership of radio stations. Rupert Murdoch had to become an American citizen when he was creating his American media empire. So we've always had these deep and important platform restrictions to facilitate the creation of a country and to facilitate the creation of coherent political communities. And that's the point of free expression. It's not so that anybody can say anything and develop who they are. It's to create political communities and some element of liberty.
Interesting. But I mean, I guess it's just a different situation now, because in the past you could go to the local pub and say, I don't like these people, or I think Hitler was great or whatever. But you didn't, unless you owned a media company or, had a column in some paper, you couldn't reach the masses. And even then nothing could go viral the way it is now and suddenly take off and reach totally new audiences and so on. So it seems like it's a slightly different scenario that we have now.
Well, so I can go back and forth on the details, because there used to be lots of newspapers. There used to be dozens of newspapers in New York City. right? And there were multiple editions,
Yeah.
and weird things did, go viral, right? It was just, there used to be all of these alternative newspapers, or tons of fanzines. There was, there were local radio, local TV. And one of the things that I think we saw in the 90s was there were a lot of like local music scenes, right? If you think about the development of jazz, the development of rock and roll, the development of hip hop, of grunge in the 90s, like all these were a function of the fact that there were localized communities, structures, and some of them did, exploded, it did very well, and some of them didn't. But what has happened today, I think, because there's a little bit of a 500 channels and nothing's on vibe to it, where we see all of these options, but it's in fact skin deep. And while there is a sort of a lot of supposed choice, the actual funding mechanisms for diversity in media have really gone away. And that's largely a function of our regulatory policy and monopolization of ad revenue. But 2,000 out of 3,000 counties in America now have no local news, daily local newspaper. And you might say, oh, well, whatever, but there's blogs and there's other things. But it's like, no, there's no one going to the courthouse. There's no one going to City Hall. There's no one going to the state legislatures and covering what is going on anymore. There just isn't. And so we can think that, well, there's so much choice and things can go viral and whatnot. But the truth is,
that wasn't the point I was making. But yeah.
But communication is just highly, highly centralized today in a way that it's never been before.
The Atlantic had a great article about, I guess there was some venture firm that was buying up all the local newspapers and have like strip mining them for cash.
Yeah.
You'd have like a few years where the advertising, would still work, even though, there was no content anymore because you fired everybody in the room, and then finally they just collapsed the whole thing like a husk.
Alden Capital is one of the hedge funds, but
yeah,
is doing it too.
That's been a disaster. I'm sure certainly there's just like we have food deserts across the US, have like news deserts where there's like a vacuum of local news at this point.
Right. And the reason that's happening is not because people don't want newspapers or because traffic is down, because traffic is not down. People are reading the newspapers more than they ever have. It's just that advertising has collapsed, and advertising has collapsed because Google stole all the money. It's not, I mean, that's what the antitrust trial is right now. If you want to buy or sell advertising right now online, you effectively have to use Google software to buy it. You have to use Google software to sell it. You have to use Google Exchange to do the transaction. You have to use Google ad networks to find the right people to market to. And Google takes between 30 and 50% of the revenue that advertisers put in, plus they redirect the money or the traffic and money and data to themselves. So like Google owns YouTube, they own Gmail, they own search. And so they have a lot of advertisers that are coming and buying in their system, and they can direct a lot of that revenue to their own properties. So it's like, this is why when you have, these social movements, take like whatever it is, whatever you want to take, Black Lives Matter, or, some of the Trump stuff or whatever it is, this kind of viral populist kind of content, it's impossible to take, even though there's huge demand, it's very hard to take that and turn it into a sustainable media business. You can do a little bit with subscriptions, with Substack and whatnot, but in the 60s and 70s, when they were figuring out, oh, there's this untapped market, and you had the alternative weeklies emerge, they actually could turn the interest and readership that they had into sustainable businesses because they could get advertising revenue from it. Today, you can't do that, because you could before 2008. It's not an internet thing either. It's a post 2008 problem, when Google systematically acquired all of the major companies in the advertising technology industry and redirected the advertising money from publishers and newspapers to themselves. So that's the crisis that we're really dealing with. You have a few massively centralized communications institutions, Google, Facebook, You could name maybe TikTok. I don't know. And
Amazon also, no.
Amazon maybe, ish, right? Because they're the third biggest advertiser, but it's a little bit. Some of the things they call advertising are actually just often called. It's actually more like paying for shelf space, which is not really whatever funded newspapers. But yeah, you could look at Amazon that way too. But the point is there's these massively centralized institutions. Apple and Google have a cartel, right? Over that was what the other antitrust suit was about with Google that just concluded. Sorry if I'm going over a lot of stuff, but like you basically the reason people are mad, my view is that you used to have some element of political control, not a huge amount, as you noted. Like, yeah, there are certain things you can do today that you couldn't do back then. But like broadly speaking, you were in a media ecosystem that reflected some of your concerns. The local, sports teams, the local, your local schools, local whatever. There was coverage. It wasn't just some random Facebook group. And today there isn't. Today there is we don't have communities that we can be a part of. Instead, we are all working through a few centralized institutions that manage us via algorithm, and then we have no say over, right? And that's why, I think if you're just in a world where you're just like this, you are an object for the purpose of being manipulated by an algorithm. I don't know why. People are mad. That's a good reason to be mad, right? And that's the situation that we're in.
Yeah. So I want to talk about obviously what's happening with Google. There was also Facebook, Zuckerberg wrote that letter about
Right.
that he'd been censored by the Biden administration. Then there was the TikTok case that you wrote about that you said had to do with this what a communications.
Section 230, yeah.
So I'd love to learn about all of that stuff. But what's the most coherent way to proceed? Would it make sense maybe for you to give us a little bit of like a history lesson as to like what were like the sort of the
Sure,
most.
I can do like what happened, sort of the formation of the internet, like how our regulatory choices sort of took us from a world of kind of localized control to this world where we have centralized power, right? And then you have people like Mark Zuckerberg who are, pretending that they were forced by the government to do things, right? Which whether Mark Zuckerberg did it himself, whether the government told him to do it, whether it was a good thing or not, these are all irrelevant points. The question is always, why do we have a system where Mark Zuckerberg has this amount of power, or the government can go to Mark Zuckerberg and, conjoined have that amount of power? If you build a system like Facebook, someone's going to use it, right? It's like, so the question is, why did we build that system, right? Not, oh my gosh, we're using this all-powerful system in a way that I don't love, right? Censor this other way, don't censor me, censor my enemies, right? So what happens, right? So we have a system in America really going back to, the development of the concept of the free press really is the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, like the levelers in the 1650s. And this English Civil War has a huge impact on the development of the American colonies. And that in many ways sets the stage for American newspapers, the free press here, much more than it does in England, and localized control over media markets. Advertising has always been foundational to our country. Advertising is important for newspapers because it gives them a financing source that is independent of the state, right? We don't like advertising necessarily. It's annoying, it can be useful, but like when you read your newspaper and it's 1800, often they're very partisan, or they're business journals or whatever. They're not funded by the state. They're not funded by aristocrats. They're funded by advertisers. In Europe, they're funded by the state. They're funded by aristocrats, and they don't report on power. In the US, there's a lot of diversity, and they do, right? It's a rambunctious world. And so you move that forward, you have regulation of the telegraph, you have regulations on a whole series on radio, and as technology moves forward, telephone. And the idea is to allow local control. In fact, until 1996, and we'll get to 1996 in a second, telephone networks in the US were actually regulated at a city level. A lot of people don't realize. Telephone regulation in America has historically been done at a municipal level. And the reason is because that's where you put the wires. You put all the wires in, and it used to be like you'd have a race to put as many, for the different companies competing in the 1880s and 90s, to put as many wires as they could. And finally, the municipalities stepped in and said, no, too many wires. We're going to just regulate this. And that rolled into regulation of the system. And there were federal regulations too, but it was at first a municipal regulatory framework. It was also regulated through the use of patents, and it was regulated on an anti-monopoly with an anti-monopoly lens. So AT&T actually stands for American Telephone and Telegraph. And in 1913, AT&T had owned Western Union, and the government forced them to spin off Western Union. So that extra T was there for no reason for 100 years, right? We broke up AT&T 3 times in the 20th century, 1913, 1950, and 1982. Americans are always suspicious of large concentrated centers of power, particularly in communications, right? So we broke up ABC, I think, and turned it into NBC and ABC, or maybe it was we broke up NBC in the 1940s. Like, this has always been something that's been of concern. So the 1970s, 1980s happens. There's this intellectual movement that says concentrations of power don't matter. The only thing that matters is efficiency. This is a very weird moment. And this happens not just in media, but across the board. And, you know, there's a sort of left-wing socialist vibe to it. The people that instrumentalize it are conservative law and economics scholars. People like Milton Friedman, he's probably the most famous one, Robert Bork, a whole series. You might have heard about Project 2025, which is the thing that Democrats are going off about right now. There's kind of like common intellectual origins there, and like heritage is kind of the professionalization of some of those views. But it was largely the law and economics school that instrumentalized it, but they were building on top of a kind of left-wing historical framework. The socialist left claimed that populist legacy in America of decentralizing power never really existed. It was always just, we're always just a capitalist country, right? And so by building, so the 1970s and 80s, these intellectual movements come in and they win, right? And they say, we have all this inflation, there are all these problems in the 70s, and the reason is because we're not listening to economic experts enough, and we're prioritizing silly things like concentrations of power instead of important things like economic models of efficiency. And so that's what begins the rollback of antitrust laws and the move forward of deregulation. And so you see deregulation across the board in transportation systems, in media systems, in finance, in pretty much everywhere. And it starts under Carter, so it starts as a Democratic initiative, and then Reagan amps it up. And then in 1996, we passed the Telecommunications Act. And the Telecommunications Act does things like lifts caps on the ownership of the number of radio stations that you can have. So that's when Clear Channel buys up thousands of radio stations. And there used to be local DJs. No longer, there are no longer local DJs, because they can just have one guy who's national, and he's on every radio station, right? Clear Channel, eventually that becomes Live Nation, which then eventually buys Ticketmaster. It also, and this is important, in the Telecom Act of 96, there's something called the Communications Decency Act, which applies traditional obscenity rules that had always applied to all these other forms of communication to the internet. And the Supreme Court rules that that's unconstitutional. It's sort of badly written. It's not really administrable for the internet, but rather than saying that, the Supreme Court just says you can't do anything to restrict the flow of information online. And also they were like, don't worry, we'll figure out like filtering mechanisms so that parents can control what their children get online, and we're going to innovate our way out of it, right? It's very much this libertarian framework. But there's one part of the CDA that's retained, and that's this thing called Communications Decency Act Section 230, the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And what that says is that liability for speech, right, which has always been one of the restrictions on speech has been defamation. You can't defame someone or engage in infliction of emotional distress, all sorts of things that you can't do. We're going to say that that still applies, but if you are a platform and someone uses your platform to talk, right, and this was at the time, this was chat rooms like AOL or Prodigy or CompuServe, that you're not liable for what third parties say. And if you try to put together like filtering mechanisms in a good faith attempt to weed out obscenity or fraud or just harmful speech, whatever, you're not liable, right? Courts kind of misinterpreted Section 230 and said, well, you know what? No matter what you do, you're not liable for what someone else puts on your platform. And this turned into, okay, you know, two things happened. One of them was you had this section, like the internet became a lot more than chat rooms. It kind of stretched over large swaths of the economy. And the second thing that happened is the judges expanded it and said, you know, you can do, actually, I should say the second thing that happened is because we relaxed the antitrust law, there were a whole series of platforms that were monopolistic that were born and grew and consolidated their way to dominance starting in the 1990s. So this is Amazon's founded in 95. I think Google's founded in 98. Facebook is founded in 2003 or 4. And they have effectively kind of roll up their particular spaces. Apple was founded in the late 70s, but they kind of got a new lease on life with the iPod in the early 2000s. And sort of those four companies become dominant as the internet emerges and kind of takes over how we exchange information. So now you have these companies can do anything they want, and they are dominant in different lines of business, and they can redirect flows of information or data or money to whoever they want, and they're not liable for anything, right? So TikTok emerges, and it's not profitable right now, but there's a lot of people that use it. Or Facebook emerges, and it doesn't matter when Facebook gets an ad and puts it in front of people, they're not liable, or they haven't traditionally been liable for it. When they cut a deal with a gambling app and they put that gambling app in front of people who are there knowingly harming, they're not liable for it. When they allow scam artists to steal identities of soldiers who are at war and use those identities to steal from women who think they're dating these men because they've established an online relationship, actually just a catfish scammer. Yeah. Facebook knows about it and is not liable because of the expansive reading of Section 230. So all of these, the monopolization and then the ability to discriminate using algorithms are a function not of technology. It's not that the internet just did this or developed this particular way because that's just what science leads us to. It's a regulatory story. We chose to pass these laws. Judges chose to interpret them the way that they did. And as a result, we have a media environment that is highly, highly centralized and consolidated. So that's kind of the history lesson. Now you're seeing a lot of pushback, but we kind of are still at the stage where we're trying to figure out, all right, do we not want, are we going to actually really enforce laws against concentrations of power again? Are we going to deal with conflicts of interest? Are we really going to make these platforms liable? You have a whole elite that, is in power and only knows how to run a system the way that it's being run. And that's the conflict that we have.
Yeah. Cool. And yeah, I mean, like, so Google, it's funny, a number of years ago, not even that long ago, I spoke at Sergey Brin's private dinner at Burning Man about the sort of ecological emergence. I had a little direct access to him. I mean, I guess I've also met Eric Schmidt, I guess. I mean, you're not really, I guess the company was just doing what companies do, right? They were trying to make a bigger and bigger profit and sort of like, putting jigsaw puzzle pieces together that made it easier for them to grow and so on. I mean, do you think they had a particularly nefarious intent, or is just kind of the logic of the system that led to this?
Well, I would say, so Eric Schmidt came from Novell, right? So there was this networking systems company.
Novell?
Novell was a networking systems company, and they got crushed by Microsoft in the 90s. And then Eric Schmidt, there was a bunch of them, like a lot of the people at Google actually came from companies that were crushed by Microsoft. And then Microsoft had an antitrust case against them in 1998 and was kind of pushed back. It was sort of the last gasp of the old era of antitrust. And Eric Schmidt saw what happened, and he saw why Microsoft got dinged. And it was because a couple of reasons. One, Microsoft didn't have a lobbying presence. And
Yeah.
two, they were extremely arrogant, openly arrogant about what they were doing. And so he said, okay, my lesson is not that you shouldn't monopolize. My lesson is you need to be the monopoly this time. Like, I'm going to be the monopoly this time. I'm not going to be the guy that gets crushed. And that's what a lot of them thought. I'm not.
Microsoft didn't exactly get crushed. I mean,
No, but it didn't get crushed, but I think like it was a deep humiliation. If you talk to people there, the people who were running Microsoft kind of had to effectively leave. Like Bill Gates left Microsoft, right? He is still important, right? But a whole series of the whole way of doing business changed. And there were people at Microsoft who got thrown out because they were super aggressive. They felt really overwhelmed by what had happened, and it took them about a decade to recover. But you're right, they didn't get crushed. And the penalty should have been a lot more aggressive.
What were actually the practical outcomes of that? Like, were they forced to diversify or sell off different divisions? Or
well, the most important outcome, in terms of the market structure, so what happened with Microsoft is they saw the internet, right? And they had Windows, and they had their Office suite. And then all of a sudden the internet emerges, and they see Netscape, and they're scared because they're like, oh my gosh, you know how you have Chromebooks today?
Yeah.
Right? And a Chromebook is a computer, and the operating system is the browser.
Yeah.
Like that was sort of one of the threats, is that Netscape was just saying, well, we'll get rid of Windows because you can just run your computer on Netscape with a server in the background. So Sun Microsystems. And that was the fear. And so what Microsoft did is they said, we are going to, well, one person said, cut off Netscape's air supply, and they put they put Internet Explorer in with Windows, and then they said that would have been okay, but what they did is they went to anybody that sold computers with Windows on it and said, you can't put Netscape on Windows, or else we won't sell you Windows. And so they were able to control the gateway to the internet. Now, they started going around to venture capitalists and saying, here are the areas in the internet you're allowed to invest in, and here are the areas that are just for us. And they talked about just taking a VIG on every transaction online. This is in the they tried to buy into it, which they thought, well, banking is really important. So nobody knew how things were going to develop. Social media didn't really exist yet, and et cetera, et cetera. But they were like, we control the gateway. When the antitrust case hit, Microsoft got scared. And so Google, they thought, in 1998, Google comes in, Google's gaining traction, and they thought about putting a warning on their website saying, this site is dangerous, you shouldn't go there, right? But they didn't do it because they were afraid of the consequences from the government and from the public because of what had happened in the antitrust case. So Google really only exists because of that case. Same thing with Facebook.
Why would they have been dangerous from the Microsoft?
Oh, they wouldn't have been dangerous. That Microsoft would have been lying, but the idea would have been to crush Google, right? Or they could have just said, when you have Internet Explorer, you're not allowed to. You type in www.google.com and it doesn't direct anywhere, right? Like the point is they were the gateway, and they were the choke point, and then they decided, we're not going to enforce our power. They had always enforced their power as a choke point through Windows. And they stopped doing that after the antitrust. That's the most important thing that happened out of that case. So that the internet developed the way that it did, with a lot of innovation in the early 2000s up to kind of 2006 and 2007 because of that case. In 2000, I think it was 2004, 5, or 6, there was an antitrust case called Trinco. It was Verizon v. Trinco, which was a unanimous Supreme Court case that said that monopolization law is basically dead, right? They said you can't really bring a Sherman Act claim on monopolization anymore. And Scalia wrote the opinion and said monopolies are actually, they're not only not bad, they're actually an important part of the free market system, right? This is in the Supreme Court decision. And so at that point,
just to remind people who might be rusty on this, and I admit, I've heard of the Sherman. Just give us a 1 minute or 30 seconds.
Yeah, so the body of laws that are supposed to prohibit monopolies are what are called antitrust laws. And they're called antitrust laws because in the 1880s and 1890s, when we didn't have big corporations, we had what were called trusts.
Yeah.
And, like if you look at like Union Trust Bank or something, it's the same trust type of corporate structure. But basically, it's just, instead of calling them corporation laws, which is what we would call them today, they ended up calling them antitrust laws, and we still use that term. So the big one that was passed in 1890 was called the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was named after John Sherman, who was a senator from Ohio, and that prohibits monopolization and restraints of trade. So this is commonly understood to mean cartels, so price fixing, and companies that have huge amounts of market power on their own and use unsavory tactics to maintain or gain that market power. You also have the Clayton Act, which prohibits, certain business practices like tying two products together that you shouldn't, saying if you want to buy product X, you have to also buy product Y. If you have market power, not allowed to do that. And it has some merger prohibitions. It's a body of law that's designed to say corporations can't get too powerful.
Okay, cool. That's enough. I just wanted to sort of have a little bit of a backtrack.
Sure.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So the Sherman Antitrust Act is what we used against Microsoft. It's also what we used against AT&T in the 80s. There's a long history.
Scalia and the Supreme Court kind of disemboweled it.
So Antonin Scalia disemboweled the part of it that said monopolization is illegal, and it also enforcers kind of gave up after that. And so when that happened in 2005, I think it is, or 2004, everybody in Silicon Valley is like, including like Eric Schmidt, is like, all right, we got to be the monopoly or we're going to get crushed, right? And so it's in a sense, you could say, oh, it's nefarious because Eric Schmidt does a lot of lobbying and is very politically powerful. But in another sense, you could just say, hate the game, not the player, right? So there's a huge like roll up of power, right? In 2006, I think Google buys YouTube, right? That's what one thing people would recognize. In 2008, they bought a company called DoubleClick. They buy a whole bunch of companies in the ad space. One of them is called AdMob, but there's like a lot of most of Google's products, except for search and maybe Gmail, but Gmail are a function of acquisitions, right?
Well, similar to Facebook buying Instagram.
Same with Facebook, they bought Instagram and WhatsApp. Same with I guess probably not Apple. Amazon has a lot of acquisitions, particularly like a lot of their robotics for their warehouses, but also a bunch of other things. Microsoft buys huge numbers of companies, and anyway, so that's Eric Schmidt is like, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to just monopolize our way to power. And interestingly, like one of the people that he hires in 2001 is Sheryl Sandberg, who then goes over to Facebook, right, as Mark Zuckerberg's number 2. Where does he hire Sheryl Sandberg out of? He hires her out of the Treasury Department. She's Larry Summers's chief of staff. Larry Summers is the Clinton Secretary of the Treasury.
Yeah, who's now on the board of OpenAI.
Right. I mean, he's got a lot of like, but the point is, Eric Schmidt doesn't hire a technologist. He hires a political person. This is weird and different, right? You got this rocket ship in 2001, this search engine rocket ship that's like, we do this cool, fancy stuff, organize the world's information. Why are they hiring somebody out of the Treasury Department to do their business strategy? The reason is because Eric Schmidt understands that it's a political game. Why does she go over to Facebook? Mark Zuckerberg is very clear about it. He actually said publicly, in many ways, Facebook is more like a government than a business. We're really setting policies. And that's why, and he's talking about why he hired Sheryl Sandberg. So these guys understand that they are political institutions. They're so big that they are kind of governing forces, and they need those kinds of skills and connections and not the skills of just technology or scientific advance.
I guess there's also on the sort of
Yeah.
conspiracy side of the street ideas that, like, the CIA sort of had a hand in Facebook maybe from early on, and kind of like, there were deals between, I mean, maybe you don't think that's legitimate, but there's, people do have those kind of concerns.
Well, I don't think that it would be, I mean, it wouldn't be unusual for that to be the case, right? I don't,
I mean, that's the thing with the Pavel Durov Telegram situation, right? Like, he refuses to put a backdoor into Telegram so that the communication is actually protected, my understanding. So people are communicating in these big groups, and there's no way for you to, as a government, to get a spy, into that communication.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm like that. Again, I don't know the details with Telegram. I mean, so I'm not gonna speculate as to that.
The story, but this is from Glenn Greenwald, who we can trust or not trust, but is that actually, Pavel Durov became a French citizen, and I guess Macron had invited him to this dinner to come to France, but they actually nabbed him at that point. So this was like a prepared thing because they wanted, to create a backdoor. And you have people like, Greenwald and Taibbi who think that, there's sort of collusion between like the establishment center, kind of Macron and the Democrats, to create this sort of global technocratic, kind of apparatus where they want to be able to surveil everybody and so on.
Well, so let's take it out of this, out of Telegram for a second, because I love Glenn and I love Matt. They're awesome, right? And I've been friends with, I know Glenn much better than Matt. But Glenn, I mean, I've known him since 2005. I have a huge amount of respect for him. What I think, though, is that we have a kind of different view of politics and authority, right? A slightly different view, not entirely, but slightly different view, which is like, at a certain point, Apple was saying, we're not going to let the FBI into, iPhones, right? We're not going to let them hack iPhones if they want to, right? And you see, maybe a better example is this TikTok thing. So this is the case on Section 230 where the judges are starting to roll back Section 230. So TikTok was showing kids this like a challenge, one of the blackout challenge, which was the videos that said, try to strangle yourself for as long as you can. And they were knowingly showing it to kids because kids liked watching it. And a bunch of kids harmed themselves or killed themselves accidentally because they were trying to do the blackout challenge. In this lawsuit I think it was in Pennsylvania. It was a wrongful death lawsuit. So they sued for wrongful death and a negligence, a couple of other things. And they sued TikTok and they said, you are putting these videos in front of kids and my kid died. And you're going to be liable for that, right? It's not murder.
Just to clarify, but the issue of the liability is not simply that the videos were on TikTok because they would have still been protected as a platform. It's that somehow their internal recommendation system was actually promoting that content.
Correct. That's right.
But was that something that they were doing consciously, or was it just like their own, algorithms and recommendation systems like automatically push this to the top because they see the kind of engagement it's getting?
That's actually a great question. The answer is they were doing it intentionally.
Okay.
So if it was purely engagement driven, they probably wouldn't have been found liable, but they were segmenting via demographics. And that's, the court said, you can't, I mean, this has gone up to the Supreme Court in a slightly different case. It was not just a pure neutral algorithm. There were discrete choices made. There was an algorithm, but it was discrete choices. And they had been told these videos are harmful. So, all right, you can say that it's a prohibition on free speech to tell TikTok that they can or can't show these videos in a certain way.
They can show them and promote them. They can't be part of it.
Right. But like, exactly, like
recommend it or
you could say that, and it would be true. It is a restriction on TikTok's ability to show content that they would prefer to show. And it's the government doing it, right? this is very clear. It's like a political choice from the government to say you can't say this, you can say that, right? It's content neutral. So they're not saying, here's what you have to say and here's what you can't say. What they're saying is, if you do things that cause harm, you can be liable for it. But it is still, in a sense, a restriction on speech. They are responsible for the speech that they offer. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think it is the role of the government, our democratic systems, to structure speech the way that builds a society, and a society that allows dominant platforms to encourage kids to take the blackout challenge. That's not a society. It's something that falls apart. Similarly, if you can't get into an iPhone because Apple doesn't want to let the government get in there because they're afraid of the government, what about all of the criminal activity and murders and all the bad things that people are doing, and you have a warrant saying, hey, this guy, molested my kid. I want to, we need the evidence of it, right? I mean, is that like the government is going to have to, it's either the government doing it or it doesn't happen, right? And I think that if you don't have some mechanism for authority to use its authority, then what you're not promoting liberty, you're promoting chaos, and ultimately you're promoting what will become an atomized society that just will seek totalitarianism. And that's where I kind of
We'll see totalitarianism.
Yeah, you're just going to be, people are going to go off and say, I want a strong man, because I don't believe in, when people confuse authority with authoritarian, which is what's happening now, then, when we need authority to do something that we all agree is useful, like prevent child porn or prevent like some sort of harm, we're not able to call upon it in any legitimate way. And then ultimately people will say, well, I can't call upon authority to help my society or to help my community or help me when I need it, then what use is this whole democratic system that we have? I want to, that guy says he'll get the people that I don't like. I'm going to go for that guy. And that's a weak government, that is an invitation to dictatorship.
Yeah.
And that's what I believe.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I guess also the similar with Instagram, right? Like how it's like promoted like teen depression, teen girl suicide. Maybe it wasn't quite as explicit.
No, I mean, I think they were told too, but like, going back to Telegram, right? The allegation is that the allegation is this guy was there was a bunch of crime that was happening on Telegram, and he did it or he didn't do it, or he knew about it or he facilitated it.
He just created a platform where he didn't have any influence over it, and nobody could. The government couldn't get in there.
Well, I think, but they didn't arrest him because they were like, you didn't put a backdoor in that we.
No, because the criminal activity is happening, and they're saying that somehow he's responsible. I assume. I mean, that's what.
Right, and to me, that's a factual determination, right? And you can, like, the thing is I think there's like a pretty legitimate point to say I don't trust those systems, right? With you have like Julian Assange, or you have like what's going on in Gaza, or all these other things where you're just like, it's very obvious that the government is not legitimate in what they're doing, and our systems have broken down, or the bailouts, or all these other things. There's a lot of reasons to be very cynical and skeptical of government. And this is the challenge that we're in, right? Where you can look at this guy and you could say, well, the government says that this guy is doing a lot of crimes, and that's bad. And you can make one or two conclusions. One conclusion is we need to make sure that those systems are more legitimate so that we can actually determine whether he committed crimes, and risk our faith in government being misplaced. Or we can choose to say there should be no governance, right? And when we need authority, we can't call upon it. The governing government won't misuse its authority because it won't have any. But when we need authority, we can't call upon it. And that is I think those are the two choices that you have to make in this situation.
Cool, man. I'm really appreciating this dialogue, by the way. It's helping me think through things. So let's just I wanted to articulate the distinction between your perspective and like Greenwald's, and maybe Matt Taibbi's also. Like, so for them, for Greenwald, I mean, he sees this sort of government intrusiveness as kind of working against human freedom in some way, whereas you see necessary to preserve society's function and to actually have a level of freedom for society.
Right. I think both of us would say that a large swath of government activity has lost its legitimacy, right? There's been enough bad faith and lying at high levels of government that we can both agree that you can't trust powerful government officials, and that is a crisis. And I think where he's just sort of more skeptical, I don't think it's possible to have a society where we just sort of pull back on governance. All that does is push more power into the hands of unelected people, and dominant corporations. I think we have to find our way through. Glenn has more. I think Glenn just doesn't see as much value in the institutions as I do. I think he's kind of sees it on the other way. So like, well, we can't really afford to allow the US government to have this amount of power. And if you roll that back, hopefully we'll muddle out our way through that the other way, right?
Yeah. And then also, so I guess in a way that it becomes kind of like ambiguous. I mean, there's a gray area in terms of what's going to be permissible. Like, for instance, if you are, strenuously Christian, anti-abortion, then, that's going to be part of what you want to control. You want to stop people from having abortions and doing something, that for other people would be totally fine. Or another example would be China, right? Where like, I mean, they have a much deeper control over, social media and communication, right? So like,
Right.
TikTok functions very differently in China. And I mean, in some ways it sounds better. Like kids are restricted, they can't use it all the time. And
Right.
if they watch, I don't know if it's like 2 hours of TikTok videos, they have to see an hour of like, educational content. So it's not such a, brain rot,
Right.
but we feel that's actually like a deep level of social control. So how do you kind of like draw these distinctions of what?
Well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that like that China saying, we're going to regulate what kids watch is some sort of authoritarian impulse, right? I mean, we had educational programming on TV and radio, and we have libraries, we have schools. Like it's every society makes the choice to structure how we raise our young, and it's just that, and we've just happened to have been in this crazy period since the kind of 1980s, 1990s, where we're just sort of like, yeah, we'll have kids do really stuff that's really harmful for them. And that's not inherent to democratic society. And it's certainly not inherent to an authoritarian society that they raise kids well. It's just they're, in that particular way, China is governing effectively and we're not. I would say in many other ways, China is not governing effectively, and we are. But this is, again, we're conflating authority with authoritarian, and I think like we're not regulating what kids do. We are regulating what kids do. We're just saying Google and Facebook and TikTok are going to be the regulators, and they're going to regulate in ways that are harmful. That's a regulatory schema. It's just one that I don't think anybody likes. And we've just chosen to say, well, we're gonna have these, I think of them as political officials. They're just not elected.
Yeah.
So,
right. I mean, would that mean like in a kind of, not in a perfect world, but in a better world, would there be a level where some of these platforms are almost like nationalized and like, there's more, like a post office or something. I mean, it's like almost like Facebook discovered like the global post office.
right. Well, you can do, I mean, the question isn't really like, so nationalization gets to ownership structure. And I don't think ownership structure is that important here. The question is some sort of public control, right? And nationalization introduces other problems. Like if the US government owns Facebook or owns Twitter or owns any of these platforms, what happens in other countries? These are not national platforms; they're global platforms. So I don't really have a problem with private ownership of these platforms. We've had private ownership of communication platforms forever, really. but you need some sort of public control, not total control, but some sort of public control. And that would be regulation. And that's how we've always done it. So, you're starting to see some of that happen. You're starting to see that some parts of government getting more aggressive about what these companies can do. There are laws on tracking, children's tracking. The Federal Trade Commission has gotten fairly aggressive and has consent decrees against YouTube and TikTok and Facebook. And they're actually like starting to Facebook has violated their consent decree multiple times. And so now the FTC is saying, they're trying to implement an order that Facebook can no longer track children and they can't do targeted ads to kids. And Facebook is fighting it really hard. So there are, the Section 230 rollback in the Third Circuit is an example of us saying, you know what, we're not going to allow TikTok and these platforms to do whatever they want without liability. We're going to actually say you are liable for the harm that you cause. So there is I think an intellectual and cultural shift happening.
And what about another example, obviously, is, the platform formerly known as Twitter, X, with
Right.
Elon Musk at the helm, where, he promotes his own content, including, promoting, neo-Nazi rhetoric, or, like how would that be handled in kind of like some kind of ideal circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I guess what you would say, I mean, I think people don't necessarily like the way that Twitter works, but I don't see anything illegal about it. I mean, I guess if you're causing people harm, then you should be like, if your algorithms are causing people harm, then you should be liable for that. But I don't know. I mean, beyond that, I'm not really sure whether there's a policy problem involving Twitter. Yeah.
But even though it's aggregation of centralized power, right? Like he's created this, I mean, he's going to be a trillionaire in a few years, apparently, but he has the satellites, he has the public square.
Well, but that's different. The satellites is a different problem than Twitter, right? I mean, I think the Starlink and SpaceX are, it's really interesting because Musk is a weird character, right? I like, like when I look at someone like Jeff Bezos, I think of, he just seems kind of predatory, and Mark Zuckerberg, same thing. These are guys that just sort of are finance people that kind of, Jeff Bezos explicitly came from a hedge fund and he was like, I want to start a monopoly. Mark Zuckerberg kind of found his way there. But Elon Musk, his companies do real things, right? Like electric cars. They're real. Like they're physical things that are hard to build. He bends metal, right? The spaceships are good, right? The Starlink is a good product. So, and it is hard in our financial system to invest in capital intensive goods. And Musk has found a way to do that. Now, he kind of can convince financiers to back him. And I don't like a lot of what he does, but the way that I mean, I think he's more akin to somebody that actually kind of creates things than he's not like a con artist. He's kind of half con artist, but half like creator. And so I think when you're looking at some of the things that he's doing, I would apply traditional anti-monopoly rules to them. Like, for example, with SpaceX, I would separate out SpaceX and Starlink, and I would force him to divest Starlink. And you can do that because Starlink is regulated by I believe, like the Federal Communications Commission. I mean, it's launching into space is highly regulated. I might put price caps on SpaceX just because, SpaceX is essentially a utility sending satellites up to space. And you should probably have, and they're basically a monopoly for that. So you should just have price caps on that. And then don't allow them to own something that requires sending satellites up, which is Starlink, right? So they have a very strong incentive to not send rival satellites up of a rival communication system because it's the same, So I would sort of split some of those things out and I would regulate them. And I think those are more of a policy problem than Twitter. Twitter just seems to be like a place where the elites, a lot of political elites talk to each other and are kind of mad that like Trump style people exist. And that I don't, that's kind of the way I look at it.
And what do you feel about, so we're both on Substack, which has been like actually a big boon in my life, probably it seems like in yours too.
Yeah.
There is a sense of like, yeah, there used to be, as you say, newspapers or magazines, or there would be like kind of like a movement of ideas, or now it's like everybody's kind of like disintermediated, like everybody is like has their own little platform. I mean, do you see a possibility for like some kind of return to, yeah, I guess kind of more like
Yeah, so right now there's an antitrust case in Virginia against Google for its control of advertising, right? Google has the revenue is about $20 billion a year in what's called Google's network division. And the company, I think, has about $300 billion of revenue, $300 billion, something. So it's a relatively small part of the company, but it is actually in many ways foundational to what they do for a variety of reasons. And that is money that should be going to publishers through advertising networks, but is not. And it's probably a lot more than $20 billion if you actually split it off from the company. Now, let's say you take so in 2006, advertising revenue total for newspapers was about $60 billion. Now it's much less. It's probably $2-3 billion, something like that. You could probably just breaking up Google's monopoly over advertising technology. You could probably immediately increase the amount of money in the advertising realm that goes to newspapers by a couple of $1 billion, right? Mm-hmm. And that will finance the creation of media institutions. So the problem with Substack, and I love Substack. I'm a blogger back from the 2000s, and Substack is very similar. It allows me to do journalism and allows people to subscribe to it. But I'm not really building an institution. It's really just me, and I get to make some money at it and buy, defamation insurance and whatnot. But it's not building an institution. If this case goes the way that I hope it does, right, and all of a sudden Google isn't the gateway to advertising anymore. Substack can build an advertising engine, right? And advertisers will come to it. And that would allow, that will probably allow for the creation of media institutions, taking some of the things that, people are doing on Substack and actually turning them into, organizations that can hire, and do more investment in content. And I think that's kind of like what I do is I read cases and I write about them and I will interview people, but I don't have long form investigative journalism. You need real money to do that. And if you can get some of that advertising money back into the ecosystem and away from Palo Alto housing values, then you will start to get that real investment again. And I think that'll be very powerful. I think that could be, I think we could see, Substack is a skeleton of what could exist.
And but do you think that ultimately the Supreme Court is so tilted towards centralization and monopolization that if it gets to that point, they'll just
No, I think the Supreme Court will. I think the Supreme Court is gonna. So this particular antitrust case on ad tech, if it goes to the Supreme Court, I think the Supreme Court will uphold a good remedy on Google. I mean, in 2005, the Supreme Court, it was 9-0 for this bad decision. I think most of those people have rolled off the court. Not all of them. I think Roberts was on the court then, but most of them are new. Most of them are pretty skeptical of monopoly power. I mean, in 2004 or 5, when they made this decision, the economy seemed fine, right? It wasn't there were a lot of people that didn't like what was going on, but it was before the financial crisis, right? So ideologically, there didn't seem to be a big problem with the economy. Today, I think most people feel the economy is rigged by the powerful because we explicitly saw the bailouts happening. That wasn't the case in 2004 and 5 or in the 90s or in the 80s when a lot of these policy decisions. There was a view that if you did well, it's because you deserved it. And I think today there's a view that if you do well, it might be because you deserve it, but it might also just be because you have power and you're using that power. And there's been some, I think the Supreme Court, like Clarence Thomas has written some really interesting arguments about monopoly recently. So it's not, so has Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I think you wrote that piece about the rental fixing, right? Was that
Yeah,
on?
yeah.
So that's a super fascinating thing. Essentially, there was like a company that built a software that allowed for like price fixing, and that's why rents are like skyrocketing in all across the US.
Yeah. The rents, landlords, there's been consolidation among corporate landlords. And so you have in a bunch of different cities from Atlanta, Miami, mostly in the Sun Belt area, but not entirely, where you have a small group of landlords that control most multifamily housing or apartment rentals. They collude with each other, right? And they collude in a number of ways. But the ringleader of this collusion is a company called RealPage, which makes a software program to manage big apartment buildings, and they will collect data on what you're charging if you're a big landlord, and they will share it with all of your rivals. And so one of the conditions, so you will, and then they will make recommendations on what you should charge. So if you're a RealPage customer, they'll say, no, don't charge X number of dollars for this apartment, charge 2X of these dollars. I know that sounds outlandish, but we know all of the apartments in the area, and we know that if we collectively hold some off the market, renters will be forced to pay that amount. And that's what in fact happened particularly during the pandemic, but really since 2016, you've seen rents going up because of this collusion. And that is probably a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the Department of Justice filed a case saying that what RealPage was doing was illegal a couple of weeks ago. So, that'll hopefully go to trial fairly quickly, and we can try to bust up the rent fixing conspiracy.
Very cool. Listen, thank you very much for all this time. I know you want to go out for a walk, and it's a beautiful day, so I don't want to keep you forever. But I appreciate, the work you're doing. It's awesome. I have like maybe two more questions, and then we will wrap it up. One question is like, how anxious or concerned are you about Trump victory? I mean, some people feel that he really will sort of go on the rampage. It'll be kind of like the end of democracy, and he's making all these threats. Do you think that's just kind of like the institutions are still strong enough to withstand another Trump presidency with the Heritage Foundation behind him, or do you have deep anxiety that this really would be like a sea change for the US?
I think there's a possibility that he tries to establish an authoritarian regime. I don't think it's like, I'm not freaking out about it, mostly because it's not something I can control. I think it's unlikely he does it, but it's not like a trivial chance. It's not like it wouldn't be outlandish for him to do it. He's certainly said enough things that indicates that that's what he might prefer. But he says a lot of things, he just says a lot, right? And a lot of it's bullshit, and you just don't know what is and isn't. In his track record in his first term, I think he didn't really, he did a lot of really bad policy. But, in January 6th was, I think, a red line for me, but it wasn't really that any different than what Bush did in 2000, except Bush was successful and Trump wasn't. It worries me that he did that, but it doesn't, a lot of, I think the liberals want to freak out about Trump. He is a force that gives them meaning, right? And I try to resist that temptation and look at what he actually, like his actual policies. And a lot of his policies were just sort of standard bad, policies of the Republican Party to help big business and big banks. And, that's very dangerous stuff, right? It's just the kind of stuff that people have been seeing for 30, 40 years. And so they kind of don't think it matters that much. They're just like, oh, that's normal politics. That's the stuff that really freaks me out. So, because that's the stuff that gets to a situation where you have like a guy like Mark Zuckerberg in control of such a powerful platform, and then you argue about how he should use it or not. And I'm like, the construction of that platform is the danger. And so that's what I worry about. It's like if Donald Trump laid off 20,000 reporters, people would be like, oh my God, Donald Trump just had 20,000 reporters fired. But because it was Google and Facebook doing it by redirecting ad revenue, people are like, oh, that's just the market. And I think that's ridiculous. So I'm not, and it's not that I'm not worried about Donald Trump, but I just think there are these other trends that are deeply, deeply dangerous. And that's what I pay attention to.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess one last question would be, okay, people listening to this, however many people we get, what could they do to be helpful? How can they support any of this, movement towards centralization, antitrust?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is learn the language of anti-monopoly. It's a wonderful tradition. It's a really fun tradition, and it applies in whatever in lots of different contexts. So if in your industry where you work, you see power, right? And it's in every industry from cheerleading to peanut butter to search engines. You have market power questions, and start learning about these traditions. And you can learn, there's lots of books. I mean, you could read mine, but there are others. And then start to think about how to apply them to what you know, and encourage your political leaders to take up some of these issues. I mean, for example, with RealPage, you can bring an antitrust case, but you can also pass a local law banning the use of RealPage to set prices. And San Francisco just did that. So you could do that in every city and state in the country if you wanted to. And there are lots of things, like you could do this with all sorts of anti-monopoly policies. You could also just bring litigation as an ordinary citizen. So there was an antitrust case that Google lost, brought by Epic Games, and that was brought by a video game company over app stores. There are class action, there are class action suits you can bring. And if you're a lawyer, start learning about antitrust law. I mean, there's a ton of possibility here, and it's such a broad framework that we've forgotten about. I think this first step is to learn, because and I'll finish with this, what you're asking is like, well, how can people be a part of the anti-monopoly movement? In many ways, that's a little bit like asking, well, how can I improve democracy in America or wherever you are? And it's like, well, there are lots of ways, right? But the point is that you just have to learn what it means to have an empowered public, and then sort of act in the way that you know best, right? To do that.
Cool. And just the last, I'll be in the notes to the show. Where do people follow you and all that kind of stuff? Like, where do they go?
Right. So thebignewsletter.com is where I write. You can find me on Twitter at Matthew Stoller, and which you shouldn't do because Twitter is terrible, and I'm a hopeless addict.
Yeah.
And and then I'm at the American Economic Liberties Project, and there's a bunch of reports and stuff that you can download for free on that website, and everything from different healthcare businesses to semiconductors to information on Google and the free press. So that's how to find me.
Amazing. Okay, Matt, thanks so much. I learned a lot. I really appreciated it. And one of these days I may have some more questions for you, but I appreciate
I'm a big fan of yours too. So I appreciate you having me.
Great to chat.
All right.
Enjoy the sunshine.
Will do.